are these people?
This
You
is
guys
more
are
of an
gonna see.
extension to like the BRICS conversation.
Yeah, so it's mainly about BRICS. So as a lot of you guys probably know, it's like the BRICS summit ended a few days ago, and uh, so a lot of you guys might be familiar with Ben Norton, but he has a channel with geopolitical economy where he has on Michael Hudson and Radhika Desai, and they literally were talking about like Imperialism 101 for about an hour, and we're talking about BRICS and kind of trying to give us a little bit more perspective on how to understand it, because a lot of people just kind of look at BRICS in kind of like a one-dimensional way and look at it as a threat insofar as we're told to believe that China is going to like try and take over the world or stuff like that. So let me pull up my notes really quick because there's like a couple points I want to say before we start this. But basically, it's like it's really easy to kind of, as we're not really informed about what's going on with BRICS and how imperialism is described, it's really easy to kind of get into a kind of propaganda thing where we just believe that China is trying to take over the world. And I actually, to a degree, used to look at BRICS before today as potential for China through the use of yuan, because they're a country of like what 1.6 billion people, the only country bigger than them or same size as India, and India doesn't have the GDP that China has. So like I was concerned that it's like, oh, they're abandoning the US dollar for Chinese currency. Oh, so it's like they're just trading, with like a little bit more nuance to that. But anyway, the big thing is that they prioritized getting rid of the US dollar, which in a way put my mind at ease that it's not just China trying to have its own hegemony, but that they're just trying to get rid of dollarization. They're trying to de-dollarize, which is really fucking bad for the United States. I mean, needs to happen, but it's really fucking bad for us. And
it's like sanctioning the U.S. almost.
It kind of is like sanctioning.
It's like a hyper sanction of the U.S.
But what's going to replace that eventually, and what actually, the World Bank was one of the ideas for the World Bank way back in the day, was to establish a currency that could only be used for export and import between countries. Okay, it wouldn't be used between people; it'd be used between countries, and it was called Bancor. And basically, the only way it could be used was towards buying goods that would go towards the development of other countries. So you couldn't buy on speculation through Bancor. So that's why it's good to establish a currency that isn't tied to a sovereign nation and instead is like based around the benefit of the entire like BRICS community, because then you don't end up with something like what the US has, which they have the petrodollar, they have IMF, but all that stuff has to be traded in US dollars, so they're able to boost the value of the US dollar kind of artificially without much of our input. So anyway, that being said, Radhika Desai and Michael Hudson are two of my favorite economists, and Michael
Hudson's really, I don't know much about Radhika, but
I mean, I'm learning more about Radhika, but they're both Marxist economists. So you're going to freaking like, I don't know, like
you're getting the juice.
There might be some people who are libertarians or right wingers, whatever. Like at the end of the day, you can appreciate Marx for what he wrote as far as understanding capitalism, because that's not taught in schools. That's not taught to anybody. Even Michael Hudson talks about while he was going through like his education that they didn't teach him about imperialism because the neoclassical economists who were teaching him back in the 70s thought it was stupid. Okay, so it just shows you how out of touch economists are and how low the bar is to kind of like understanding some of the core stuff of how our system works. That being said, they talk about Marx quite a bit. All I want you guys to look at it is not from like, oh, they're communists. It's like, no, Marx had a really good critique on how to understand capitalism. And I think now is the time, and I guess I'll save like the housing market stuff for another day. But now is the time, especially with BRICS, for us to start to understand how our system works instead of just making it this red versus blue thing, trying to kind of get a better, broader perspective of how it works. And I think these guys do. They brought out this episode yesterday, and I recommend watching all of it and really their whole channel. But I'm just going to talk about a few points and try and break them down a little bit more, some of the key points that they bring up in terms of BRICS and in terms of imperialism, because I think if you ask 10 people what they think imperialism is, you're going to get 10 different answers. And so with them bringing up this episode, really kind of talking about imperialism, they bring up about 10 points or so that we can go over, and it will give you a really good foundation, whether you're just like talking to somebody like you saw at the cafe, or you're talking to somebody who thinks they know their shit. Like, really, guys, the bar is so low for understanding how our system works. Just listen to these people like 2 or 3 times, and you'll start to see our system differently. So
who seem
anyway.
are said to be reluctant to do so. But despite all the predictions about the disunity and the fracas that would ensue with China having placed the inclusion of new members on the agenda, the fact of the matter is that the BRICS meeting has closed today. The BRICS summit in Johannesburg has closed today with the inclusion of 6 new members. So that's Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina. Given the large number of West Asian and North African members here, we can begin to wonder what this is going to do to US influence in what's generally called the Middle East. The BRICS countries have not only admitted these new members, but they have also agreed to set down the rules and procedures by which a large number of new members will be inducted, because, as you know, dozens of other countries have expressed an interest in the BRICS. So it's quite possible that the BRICS may well become the institutional foundation of the world majority, that as the global South and Russia are increasingly being called. They have done more things. The Western press has also sought to portray these countries, the BRICS countries, as little more than a bunch of autocracies or very iffy democracies. But in fact, despite such propaganda, what we've seen in the BRICS summit is that they have been focused on presenting a very different vision of the world order, one based on development, on people-centered development. And this has been expressed in a direct confrontation with the Western conception of the world order, which has, of course, been dressed up in the garb of human rights and democracy, but for decades has brought only poverty and exploitation to much of the world.
Well, in many ways, this was
Okay, so that's
a preliminary meeting.
They can do 125. But so, just really quick, this is kind of where it kind of clicked for me, where, as I was saying earlier, like we hear one of the things you hear a lot about BRICS is that China is like, hey, we'll trade in yuan, our goods for your goods. We won't use US dollar anymore. And that was like my concern. She's like, listen, it's about having a mutually beneficial thing, and that the priority was getting rid of the US dollar. And well, Go Star, I'll let you listen to a little bit more of this, but like it's definitely going to pay. It's definitely going to help collapse the dollar. That's why they shit on it so much, is because it represents how I'm interpreting it, as you have this block of countries, which she says later, they're not all socialist by any means, but they have some form of nationalism, and their nationalism in like kind of the broadest sense is to kind of look at it as nationalization of resources, which means like stuff like their banks, stuff like their oil gets, instead of a CEO raking in profits for themselves, that money gets reinvested back into their country. So that's kind of how I'm seeing how BRIC stands versus the Western countries, the capitalist countries, because not all BRICS countries are socialist by any means.
The problem is going to be the relationship between the BRICS and the West. How can they create a new international order that we've been discussing, while they have to pay all of the neo-colonial burden of their foreign dollar debt and the foreign ownership?
How much is that? Don't we owe like billions to China?
So he actually talks about that. So one of the really interesting things,
I was going to say,
one of the really interesting things, since you brought it up, the U.S. has this kind of, I don't know how, I can't think of the term right now, but they basically have like declared themselves kings of the world, where like because our dollar has global US reserve as a global US reserve, we don't have to pay any of our debts. We literally don't have to pay our debt. We will never
really?
pay our, we will
You just don't
literally,
have to pay it.
like that's why I want to tell you, like our 20 trillion, 30 trillion, our debt doesn't mean anything. Like it literally doesn't mean anything. Okay, so we can have our $30 trillion debt and just keep juicing it up, keep juicing it up, keep juicing it up. But then when we go to Argentina or we go to freaking Chile or we go to a country that is straddled with IMF debt, we can be like, hey, it's time for you to pay for your debt, your sovereign debt in US dollars. They can't even pay for it in their own currency. So they have to take their own currency, devalue their own currency to buy US dollars, to artificially inflate US dollars to pay for an IMF debt that is odious, something
No
that's
one's gonna
just
do
straddling them.
No one's gonna do that.
So what Hudson is talking about,
When this crashes, and why don't they just say like fuck the World Bank, fuck, because they're all
well,
like
play the rest of it, but there's like another minute of it.
all right.
He kind of goes into it.
Of
I
their
know
oil
there's
and
like so good questions.
mining rights and public utilities. How can they enforce the climate cleanup costs on foreign oil and mining pollution if the current international law says that the companies have a right to sue any government for a new tax on multinational firms or new regulations, and so that it means the government has to pay all of the cleanup costs, all of the external diseconomies, and essentially they're put into an even worse locked-in position today than they were in the colonial period. So how can they defend themselves from this kind of U.S.-sponsored order and the regime change for countries that try to create an alternative to it? All that's going to have to wait for the future BRICS meetings, and we really can't even begin to discuss that now.
This is a part of imperialism,
what we thought,
and this is how we go from imperialism going from where you had soldiers standing at the border, colonizing, to where we're in financialization of colonization, where they make it so hard. Like what he's basically saying is that let's say Argentina was like, we're going to nationalize our mines. They're no longer private mines. They're no longer owned by US or China or US entities or Western entities. We are taking our mines. What Michael Hudson is saying is that, okay, if you want to nationalize your mines and you want the profit generated from those mines to be reinvested back into your country instead of CEOs in another country, you have to pay fees for you to nationalize it. You have to basically pay off the CEO. You have to pay off the company for the inconvenience of losing that business. You have to go through all these hoops to decouple yourself from imperialism, from colonialism, even though even though you ask the average shit lib or something like, is there colonialism? They'll say no. Michael Hudson is making the argument that there's still colonialism. It's just not through fucking guns.
Yeah.
It's through freaking financialized colonialism. Okay. It's
like,
through freaking forcing companies.
After World War II, like I feel like people, or at least like the world in general, sort of like got like this really like bad distaste. I mean, everyone saw the Holocaust. Everyone like, it's very fairly recent too. So I feel like a lot of people grew like this like distaste for like this. Well, I mean, it's still, I'm not saying that it doesn't still happen. It obviously does, but there's like there's more of a distaste for war. It's like less cool than it used to be back in like the 1920s. So now we see like the weaponization of finance, and the U.S. like kind of like took the lead in this, but China does it as well, and that's like
China. Yeah, it's a little bit more interesting with China because one of the things that kind of happened is that like Marx recognizes that capitalism in a way, okay, like, and I don't mean this in like a positive way really, but like Marx said that capitalism was revolutionary, okay, revolutionary in the fact that we were getting away from feudalism, okay, so that's what he was meant, revolutionary in the way that because of the way that capitalism is, it eventually gets to this point where you have monopolies, okay? You end up with like the Amazons in the world, the Walmarts of the world. You end up with these very consolidated industries. And it's like, oh, that's a great time to socialize everything because Thanks a lot, capitalists. You did great for us. You managed to make tons of money in the process. And in doing so, you ended up monopolizing an industry to the point where it's now beneficial to the citizens of the country to nationalize it and reap the benefits from the low cost of production for what you guys produce. Thank you for your service to our country. Like, that's what was supposed to happen. And instead, we got financialized capital. So it's just that's why everything's getting so miserable, is because he had a vision that, like, after things got so miserable that we were just gonna socialize everything. Like, it would make sense after there's one or two companies left that produce oil. You know, oh, there's Exxon and Shell and Citgo. There's like 3 or 4 companies. You know, oh, time for U.S. oil.
So do all these Western international companies now.
You know, like, why isn't Amazon absorbed into the USPS? Like, tell me that. Like,
so, but you can't. So, like, I don't see us like in like nationalizing any of these industries.
none of it.
These
No.
companies anytime soon. So, what happens to these companies when the de-dollarization ultimately happens? Do these companies move offshore and just completely move their operations elsewhere, operate in a different currency, and that's it, call it a done
Well,
day?
so
Or do they collapse as well?
the nature of capitalism is that they're going to seek other countries to exploit. Okay, one of the things that Radhika says later is that you have to understand that, like, a nation is just as likely to exploit another nation just as much as a class is to exploit another class. Okay, she quote, like, that's like paraphrasing Marx, but she's like, it's like, what's going to happen is the capitalist is going to be like, oh shit, Argentina joined BRICS, I'm going to go somewhere else. They're going to pack up their shit and they're going to go to another poor country and they're going to try and industrialize it until they get a clue. So we're just kind of doing this thing where we're going around in circles trying to, like, extend capitalism past its expiration. And, like, that's why I'm in the
way
position.
overdue.
Way overdue. So
like 1930s overdue.
she
I
says we hit the peak of monopoly capitalism about 100 years ago. And I mean, there's probably some argument there. Like I said, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that Amazon or Walmart isn't a monopoly. You know, like, there's, you know, most grocery stores, those are all monopolies. Like, though, like, I think anybody who pretends that we don't live in a country that isn't surrounded by monopolies is kind of fooling to themselves. And Marx saw as an opportunity to socialize at that point, you know, and that's where he saw where it was revolutionary.
You want to hop to 12:15? Or
yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do that. I just put that. Yeah, she's basically saying that, you know, some people kind of
thing. Yeah.
It's all right. It doesn't matter.
60s,
Yeah.
when I was talking to liberals and to the left wing and Marxists, they opposed nationalism. They were just coming out of World War II, and they thought the lesson of World War II was, if you have nationalism, you're going to have rivalries, and that they're going to go to war like Germany did, and like the Europe.
That's what I was talking about. Like, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from World War II, and a lot of people took it in different directions.
European countries did, England in World War I, and they thought the solution was going to be an international order where everybody will be one happy family, as if getting rid of nationalism would cure the rivalries. And what nobody really anticipated so clearly was that there has been an internationalism, but it's been a unipolar internationalism that is leading to war. Is the United States has basically declared war on the whole rest of the world with 800 military bases interfering at
there's the contradiction, right?
Another, and it's been
how many is it to the point? Like, I feel like the only, like, when we have like liberals that are like trying to, like, and you see it a lot, like a lot of liberals that go around and try to say that, you know, Chinese imperialism, Russia imperialism,
and that's one of the things I'm trying to kind of debunk tonight.
You could say that there's like slaves in Africa, sure. I don't, to whatever degree that like evil shit is going on that's occurring in other countries does not even compare to the level of the evil terrorist empire that the United States is. Not even close.
Not even close. And I think one of the things I'm trying to learn is like, it remains to be seen whether China is going to focus too much on self-interest, or something like Iran or something like Saudi Arabia. Like, what could they do with their sort of power and money that could kind of influence things more in their direction? That remains to be seen. That's why I'm optimistic about them having their version of Bancor, like a currency that they use to trade that is based around like the summation of values from all the countries participating in BRICs.
No,
Okay.
really, if there's any good news in this world, if there's any, it's this. It's because this marks the end. This is finally the nail in the coffin of everything that's fun.
It's going to be a long time. It's going to be a long time.
It's going to be a long
But
time. But this is finally a response to, or at least a degree of which countries band together and understanding the United States is fucked up. They're really fucked up.
Well, Argentina's a really good example. He's kind of talking about this a little bit, but like, let's see. Well, I guess you could just like keep playing what he's saying.
Almost the entire time since 1945, or at least since 1950. Maybe a few years it hasn't been at war. So the fact is that today's internationalism and globalization is a war economy, and the military spending by the United States has forced other countries to divert a lot of their economic surplus and government revenue towards military defense instead of putting in place the infrastructure that they'd been expected to do after World War II. And they've also become very dependent on trade in oil, in food, monopolized technology, computer chips, pharmaceuticals that are controlled by the United States as an economic weapon to replace the overt military colonialism of Europe with a financial and international investment colonialism.
No, you can keep playing it. That's a good play. You can keep playing it. That's good.
All that's backed by an enormous amount of military spending. So normally we would say that what's happened in the world is reflecting national self-interest, and that's what everybody expected after World War II. They thought that, well, economic self-interest is going to determine the shape of the world. But what American neocons imagine is a policy that serves their self-interest turns out to have led to deindustrializing the United States economy, because the U.S. self-interest is to reduce its living standards, to cut back wage levels, to polarize the economy, and to define America's self-interest as to transferring as much money as possible into the wealthiest 10%. So instead of the U.S. self-interest being the self-interest of the 99% or labor, it's a self-interest of the financial class, and that has determined the international policy that led to inviting China into the World Trade Organization to essentially use inexpensive Chinese labor.
He's talking about a couple of different things here. Because you were talking about earlier about Chinese imperialism, so I guess this is a good time to talk about this. But like basically what he's saying, and this is like such a major contradiction, like it hit me like a ton of bricks when I kind of like put this together. But basically, the capitalists, whether it's a capitalist in China, okay, we'll get to that in a second, capitalists in America, capitalists in Europe, doesn't matter, okay, they're always going to do the same thing. So hold on a second. And so their whole point, okay, is to seek labor outside of the country, okay? It's not to seek labor within their country. I'm not talking about the petty bourgeois. I'm not talking about small business owners. I'm talking about capitalists, okay? They're not investing in local markets, okay? They're not investing in local labor. They're trying to get labor from other countries. So what happens? Like a United States capitalist sets up a fucking factory in Indonesia that doesn't help an American worker. It actually like makes it harder for us, you know? So that's where this contradiction of capitalism and imperialism comes in, is that by these capitalists pursuing their own self-interest, which is consistent throughout capitalism, okay, that it ends up hurting their own local labor market.
And you see that a lot with like even recently with the blowback with Iraq. I mean, if you look with a lot of like our current and yet even every single modern foreign policy decision within the last 20 years, I would argue even longer than that, has been completely in
71 or so
chaotic and against our own interest. Look at the Russian ruble right now. It is the exact opposite.
So he even says, he even says that. So he talks about this the S&P 500, which is the top 500 richest companies in the United States, okay? Okay, get this. Top 500 richest companies in the United States: Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, all the richest companies in the United States, Tesla, etc. Okay? 92% of their profit, okay? Of their profit, the money they make, not all their cost, the profit that they make, okay? 92% of it goes to stock buybacks and dividends. Okay, so they're increasing the value of their own company artificially by buying their own company. Thus they're taking back the value. There's not as much dilution, and they're giving dividends to people who invest in the stock. So they're making the people who invest in these little pieces of paper more wealthy. Okay, so only 8% of profit from private industry, which, you know, that's how our country runs, on private industry. There is no state industry really. Only 8% goes into development. So no wonder we're freaking 30 years behind China, right? Because we have no central planning. And like, whether people want to, like, I'm not even a big fan of states, guys. Like, I'm not. But there's something to be said that when you have a country that has nationalized industries, like banks, for instance, okay, and oil and all these industries, they're able to control how their own country develops, and they're able to spend that profit, that labor power that they got from their freaking workers, across their entire nation in the best way they see fit, instead of profiting a few billionaires.
But you know why that is, right? It's sort of like a, I mean, you see this like sort of like.
Thank you, Second Sight, by the way. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks, Second Sight. I appreciate it. Like, so you see this a lot with the destabilization of like really large countries. I mean, you saw this in Yugoslavia, where like you have this really big country, and this is like the plan for Russia too, and the goal is to divide into small little tiny states, because it's easier to influence or a tinier like constitute or republic,
yeah, with
larger money and larger spending, than which ultimately you have power over anyway, individually.
So
than it is to.
I'm gonna make a little anecdote really quick, just because it's like I have this friend who works for a company that is relatively small, but even their size, they still do a little bit of colonialism based on their export. Okay, and like, I asked her, I was like, so how much do they pay these crop workers in Africa a day? And she's like, $10 a day.
Yeah,
$10 a day. And she's like, and that's more than what they usually get. They usually get $2 a day. They usually get $2, so we should be happy. And I'm like, yeah, it's time to do this show.
yeah.
Because I'm like, the point isn't that it's 5 times better than $2 a day. The point is that you're an American getting paid what, 20, 30 times that person, and like, you get what I'm saying. It's like, dude, like, the point is that we're still like the capitalists, even though this capitalist and that he's like a business owner and you could be friends with him. He still thinks it's better, in his best interest, to go pay some factory worker $10 a day to grow some beans than to have American workers. Like, and that's what Hudson is kind of saying here. Now, given her industry, we're kind of limited. And that's like a different topic. But that's kind of what Hudson is saying, is that the cheap labor is not found from the capitalist countries. It's found from the poor countries, the ones that are rich in resources. And that's to our detriment, and that's just going to keep happening. And he talks about the growing war machine, and this is why. That's why I feel like that anyway.
The positive interpretation of nations and nationalism.
Well, the U.S. Sponsored kind of internationalism really is finance capitalism. And nationalism tends to be industrial, because you want to build up your independent, you want to be self-sufficient in food, you want to be self-sufficient in basic essentials, and you need governments to take control, basically to provide the public infrastructure, the natural monopolies, communications, and healthcare, education. You want to build up your productivity by technology, and often this requires protective tariffs and capital controls and subsidies to new capital investment, research and development.
Yeah, so we kind of already talked about this
That's
stuff
basically what
earlier,
you said.
but this is what I was talking about before, about just the fact that when you have so much private industry that's monopolized, like they have so much outsized control over the government, that there is no planning. There's no planning whatsoever. It's completely in the hands of the capitalists. And this is like, I mean, this is what Mussolini called corporatism. I mean, I'd call it fascism, call it whatever you want, but like that's what it looks like. It's when we don't have any. I'm not saying that like the state should have control over like all of our lives, but like 10 oligarchs should not be controlling our country, how our country moves. It's not even moving forward, like I just think of the trains that China has. We get to fucking New York, San Francisco in like 4.5 hours if we want to.
Oh my god, the public infrastructure anywhere else, India, China, where do you want to go? It's beautiful anywhere else. We have
that's just like, it's just one example, but like the Chinese market, they own, the Chinese government owns the banks. Okay, so they're not going to issue you freaking debt that's going to put you underwater for the rest of your life.
Right. Yeah.
So it's just, anyway, yeah, we kind of talked about that point a little bit, but the next one's really good. The 23. Yeah.
Trade. He also pointed out the following, and this is it's a quote: "If free traders cannot understand how one nation can grow rich at the expense of another, we need not wonder these same gentlemen also refuse to understand how one class can enrich itself at the expense of another." So this is a very clear placing of class and nation together in the same frame. One classes exploit other classes and nations exploit other classes. So it reveals that Marx is very aware of the structures of imperialism, and equally, as we've talked about many times, Marx was also very aware that
I just want to say, like, I was kind of like more of like a class reductionist until kind of I saw this thing and started to put together. So like I'm learning as we go too. Like I didn't see the kind of like comparison between how like nations and class are related. So like it's interesting for me to kind of take that away as well. But as you were saying, like if you're one nation taking over another nation, then like it stands to reason that like an oligarch could take advantage of a proletariat, right? Like that's what she's saying. And if you don't understand that, if you don't understand how like paying somebody $10 a day is like a problem, you're not going to understand how Elon Musk is taking advantage of freaking half the country,
Oh yeah, and listen to this too.
Already.
Well, Rick, if you recognize the reality of imperialism, this implies an entire different body of economic theory. And I had to begin teaching economic theory in 1969 at the New School, and I really hadn't studied it all the way through my graduate courses because most universities found it just too silly to teach. The free trade theory assumes that everybody gains from trade. And that all trade is voluntary and it's all a choice, free market, and that if you an absence of tariffs is going to make economies more equal and more competitive, and that's just the opposite of how the world economy actually works. Because the real,
like I remember, I mean, and I
this is what they're taught in school. This is what they're taught in school today.
I went to college. I took economics classes before. I did it in high school too, and I like, and then you. Like you be like once you like get a real like you grow up and get a real like an adult understanding of how the world really works, and then you're like, so what exactly is free about any of this?
Well, and that's the liberal joke, right? You have like the liberal, you have the choice to be homeless. You have the you just have to work like more jobs at the same time. I don't know. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
want to make, which is that we should that geopolitical economy permits us to understand class and national exploitation together. Just as we put class and nation together in the same frame, we also put class and national exploitation in the same frame. And this is exactly so. You have class exploitation within a country that produces a certain kind of class power within a country. So at the international plane, what geopolitical economy explains is that the attempt by some powerful countries to subjugate other countries creates the structures of imperialism. So you have to understand the two together. And both forms of exploitation.
Let's pause this for a second. This is like such such a fucking huge, such a huge contradiction. Okay, she's basically saying that in order for capitalist countries to succeed, other countries have to not succeed. Period. Full stop. This is like there's like not a zero-sum game. Like there are winners and losers. You know, and that's like a huge contradiction that just goes over people's heads. They think anybody can be successful. There are
capitalism inherently runs on exploitation. You can't have a win. Not everyone can be a winner. But the contradiction is that there's economic systems that exist of which everyone can be a winner. They just have to bomb the shit out of them, and so that they can't exist, we just blow them to smithereens.
Yeah, exactly.
Us exploitation and the exploitation of other nations produce contradictions, because capital essentially, contradictions mean that capital would like usually to have its cake and eat it too, to have something and its opposite, and it can't always have that. So within a country, class exploitation produces a resistance from the working class. It produces crises of underconsumption and overproduction. It produces crises of falling rates of profit and all these things.
Dude,
and internationally,
like it's just, there are people who wrote books hundreds of years ago. You know, Marx wrote freaking Capital, 150 years ago, 170 years ago. Okay. He outlined all this shit.
Marx wasn't the first one. He wasn't
even the first one, but that's just like I'm learning this stuff. I'm trying to get familiar with this stuff. So when I say like the bar is fucking down here for fucking understanding like really basic like how our world works. Like people don't understand these concepts, and this sounds really simple to me in retrospect, but like I don't know, man.
Marx was more so like the first to like reveal all the contradictions within capitalism, like how that body system works. But communism has existed before.
It's not. I mean, yeah, we can.
We can talk about that.
I wasn't even trying to like really talk too much about communism, because I think there's probably people who like aren't that left.
There's no reason to harp on that.
I just think Marx has a great analysis on capitalism. I mean, I'm an anarchist.
Oh no, yeah, no, I'm Marx. Consider myself Leninist, Marxist.
I kind of forget the points that he was making, but yeah. So
erase.
Yeah. No, let's drop on.
Like for example, I was listening to all the commentary on the BRICS in the mainstream press, and as I was listening, I thought, okay, so these people are comparing BRICS and the G7 and BRICS and the G20 as though there is no history of imperialism, as though the G7 is not in fact.
I think it's literally like a terrorist organization.
Yeah, but on the other side,
Russia had the African summit, and then like they were like,
but
Voss literally called the EFF like Nazis or something like that.
I do remember that.
That's how they.
This is ironic, because she's pointing out that it's like G7 is the nations of imperialist nations. You know, like BRICS isn't the bad guys in this situation. The ones that were freaking doing all the imperializing, colonizing for freaking hundreds of years are G7.
Collection of the former imperialist countries and still would be imperialist countries that are trying to control the world. So recognizing imperialism requires jettisoning all those sanitized expressions. For example, instead of talking about US imperialism, people use terms like US hegemony. The US has never achieved anything like hegemony, as I've.
Yeah, just keep playing. She gets to the next.
Globalization. That was,
right.
Yeah, you were on that part.
Was a wave of imperialism, and the competitive imperialism open up the rest of the world's free trade organization. What we are in the main.
Sorry,
you're good.
I'm just gonna read.
ceaseless wars around the world, and so on. You have terms like globalization. I find it so appalling that the term globalization became so popular, not just in the mainstream, but also among many who call themselves critical and even Marxist scholars. Why is that? Because they use terms like globalization, or rather, by using terms like globalization, what we are completely forgetting is that this is an attempt to force the rest of the world to open up to the imperialism and corporate power of the West. All the free trade and free markets is not necessarily for the West. It's there to open up the rest of the world's economies, the poor countries, so that they are available as markets and investment outlets.
This
but
is really
equally
important.
I see where she's getting at now.
Yeah, so like just before I forget, like she's trying to push the point here that like globalists are imperialists. What their goal is what I was saying earlier. Like they run out of cheap labor in one country, they try and open up new markets. They're the globalists, right? But really what they're doing is they're just trying to find more cheap labor, more cheap places to produce. Okay, so that's the point that I wanted to drive home with that, because you see the word globalist thrown around everywhere, and like it really does just mean imperialist, capitalist, like, you know, because like as I've tried to kind of show in this video, although you should watch the whole thing, it's like there's themes that are just consistent throughout all capitalists, and they're always going to do the same thing. And when we try and do things like change the words of things, like change it from being a capitalist or an imperialist to being a globalist, we're taking away that historical context. And we want to make sure that people know that capitalists have always acted this way. They've always hunted out cheaper labor. They've always hunted out cheaper places to produce resources. Like this is what they do. So, and that's what she's driving home, and that's what I hope that like people get out of this little part.
importantly, as sources of cheap labor and raw materials. So words like, and for example, also the use of the term globalization also means that you have to say that from the late 20th century onwards, you got a second wave of globalization, whereas in the late 19th and early 20th century, there had been a previous wave of globalization. I mean, what are you talking about? That was not a wave of globalization. That was a wave of imperialism, and the competitive imperialism that that was in train at that time, that was occurring at that time, culminated in the First World War and eventually also the Second World War, because the Second World War occurred ultimately because at the end of the First World War, the so-called Versailles
here's the thing.
settlement
Here's what she's saying.
nothing.
Like freaking 100 years ago, the people calling them globalists today would have been the same people saying the globalists were responsible for the World War I 100 years ago. It's just imperialists. It's just freaking capitalists. That's what she's saying. It's been going on forever. There's no difference between George Soros today. There was a George Soros of 100 years ago doing the exact same shit.
It's basically the Rome equivalent.
Yeah,
like Alexander the Great, whatever empire or you can think of, Ottoman. It all operates in cycles.
Mm-hmm.
But groundwork.
Yeah,
for
exactly. And using the term globalization makes people forget that there are cycles. You know, it tries to turn it into one event, and that takes away the historical significance. And if we want to like predict these things, as we're trying to do, you know, then it's important to use right terminology. And I think Marx,
I mean, we can say the United States is like sort of like a unique sort of spot in history. I mean, it has its characteristics that are unique, but we can look at places like Rome and understand that like where empires come, they also fall, and
right,
this is a result of that.
Oh yeah, and they definitely get to that. So I mean, that's
Imperialism seriously involves recognizing that. It also involves recognizing that today's discourse of human rights and democracy and so on is just the dressed up, the old discourse of the civilizing mission and the white man's burden and so on in a new dress.
No, like I skipped it before, but like the stuff about that's a whole other topic that I'm not trying to like really get into. But the whole concept of human rights is liberal bullshit, and what's not included as human rights is more important to people than what's included in human rights. You know, stuff like housing, you know, stuff like communication,
clean water,
clean water. Air. Like think about exactly. Like so you know, she's talking a little bit more about that, and that's just kind of getting the weeds on a different subject. But the concept of human rights is a liberal creation. It's not a real thing. And when the liberals, the rich liberals, were the ones to create the concept of human rights, they were able to decide what human rights were, and they chose to exclude things like housing and food and clothing,
Even
and
in our foreign
maybe like
policy,
job rights.
we can examine through manufacturing consent. We have worthy victims and unworthy victims.
Yeah, exactly.
No one in this country gives a single shit about the Crimean Ukrainians that are ethnically Russian, that are getting bombed.
The ones that voted 97% to stay in freaking Russia.
Yeah, no one cares about them. They love Ukraine, except for those Ukrainians.
Yeah.
So it's just really just a pure example of that concept.
This is just a new standard of civilization being imposed. So taking imperialism seriously involves recognizing all these things.
Well, I think that what neither Marx nor even Lenin anticipated after World War I was that the most problematic international disturbance was going to be not private sector debt, but intergovernmental debt. And that's what led to the, you just mentioned the Treaty of Versailles, which really meant something radical that Europe had never experienced after any of its wars.
That's
the
probably
Napoleonic Wars and the early wars, all of the allies.
But basically the key takeaway here is that as we look at people who wrote stuff 150 years ago, it's still important to keep in mind that like they weren't aware of some of the stuff that we are experiencing today. They couldn't have predicted the absurdity of finance capital of 2023, you know, because like Marx really believed that we would have had socialism by now. He like believed we were going to have socialism 100 years ago, and the Bolshevik Revolution was like kind of like Marx's realization in a way through Lenin, right? But
I mean, does he say that specific? Does he give like a time?
I mean, that's kind of how I see it, right? Because the USSR was like kind of like the case for socialism after capitalism, after like, well, they had a monarchy, but it's kind of like the same thing. Like 1914, that was kind of when monopoly capitalism hit its peak, according to Radhika Desai. You had freaking World War One, and you had freaking, when did the USSR become the USSR?
19.
I don't know, but it sounds like that's just kind of how I see it. But you know, like Lenin tried to interpret Marx, and he did a lot of things that he thought were right. And like I haven't read enough Marx or Lenin to have like a good opinion on that, but I have some opinions, but I'll get to that stuff later. But yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that anymore. I think it's just important to say that they like Marx couldn't have predicted freaking finance capital, and like we have to give the greats a little bit of credit, because even though like socialism would be fucking a great step in the right direction, we got shafted with this crap, and like there's still like I don't know who's written the authoritative like book, authoritative critique on finance capital. I don't know if that exists yet. I know Marx wrote a little bit, according to like what volume 3, I think, talks a little bit about finance capital, but nobody's really like fleshed out finance capital, I don't think. I know Michael Hudson certainly has, but like I haven't read any of his books yet. So it's just there's things changed. The capitalists decided that they needed to keep things afloat, or we were going to end up with socialism.
Well, it was really the New Deal that really set the timer back a little bit farther. I don't like the only reason I pushed back on that because like I thought like
thank you, Second Sight. So
I thought Marx or I might be thinking of Lenin more so like envisioned not exclusive to like the Russian government, but like a world evolution of socialism. That's according to dialectics.
Well, okay? So
I don't know.
Isn't that Trotsky? Wasn't Trotsky the one that wanted like the global socialist movement?
Like Trotsky, sort of like, but like through like a constant revolution. let me.
So my idea with Lenin, my understanding of where Lenin and Marx diverged is that Lenin believed that you should have a vanguard party. Okay, you should use electoralism to get communism. Like, I think they both agreed that the state withers away and you end up with no state, class, like a stateless society at the end, which I think is a bad argument, by the way. But that's where I think that's my understanding of where Lenin and Marx diverged, was that Lenin believed that you should use the state and you should use the government and you should be a vanguard party and use electoralism to lead towards socialism and communism, as opposed to either dual power or organizing outside the state.
And also like as a like sort of like a opposing in terms of like every country needs to appear in its own form of socialism, whatever that looks like. It's not straight up for like however how a communist economy should work.
Well, it's like who said that every country will go through. I think it was either Marx or Lenin who's fucking said that. I don't know, but it was like every country goes through their own version of socialism because every country has their labor force has their own character attached to it. So when we latch onto it, I don't know. It's like a whole other thing to get into, like the Oliver Anthony thing and all the psyops things and how we get co-opted all the time. But like, that's why it's important that we kind of like understand this stuff, is so that we don't get influenced by the people who just want to make us good Republican or Democrat voters. You know, that's kind of what I'm trying to like do here. Give us the tools so that when we see somebody like RFK or Vivek or somebody who occasionally says the right thing, we can see through the bullshit, you know, or Joe Rogan or whoever, still see through the bullshit and be like, wait a second, they're having a kind of reactionary, they're having an argument that's not rooted in theory, that's not rooted in, you know, understanding of this concept as well as it should be. Let's go to 45.
Because in England,
in which most sectors of the economy are dominated by one or a small number of big corporations, at that point, society will have become ready. Capitalism will become ready for socialism. It will, because it's very simple. What he's saying is that insofar as capitalism is historically progressive, insofar as capitalism, by dragging humanity through much mud and gore, and by creating a lot of misery and anarchy, nevertheless develops the forces of production, it is because of the virtues of competition. But once competition is no longer there is no reason to keep capitalism. So capitalism had already reached its monopoly phase in the early part of the 20th century. And since then, essentially, the humanity has been suffering the cost of keeping capitalism alive in a small number of countries, you see.
Well, you're absolutely right about what Marx said, that there had to be a revolution. But he said a revolution is what industrial capitalism is all about. He said industrial capitalism is revolutionary because in England and Europe, it's gotten rid of feudalism. Its strategy of industrial capitalism is to free economies from the landlord monopoly, from the landlord class, and from predatory finance. So when he said he expected capitalism to spread to the rest of the world, he meant the capitalist revolution against backwardness, the revolution against feudal monopolies, and the revolution that he thought would indeed lead to socialism. So
just to put a pin in it, like all he's saying was that, like, when there was feudalism, you had to freaking work the crops for free and you'd be able to like have a place to live and be able to have, you know, a share of your production and be able to live there, right? And he's kind of saying that, well, hold on, I kind of like spaced off. I freaking smoked too much. That capitalism was like a step in the right direction from that. And that's where it being revolutionary comes from, is that it's a different mode of production that, for better or for worse, you know, they make the argument, Marx makes the argument that by leading to monopoly capitalism, the capitalists are actually doing the work for us by creating an environment that leads towards socialism, right? Because all the monopolies have done all the work for us. But that's not what happened. And that's kind of where we're at today. Okay, yeah, let's just
in
go
our
to
discussion
45 and I'll
we
just
just had
you can
about
go
the
to
finer points
45 and
of Marx.
yeah, you're
And the
there.
key point that people forget about Marx, even many so-called Marxists, is that Marx understood that capitalism was contradictory. This is often forgotten, and if it wasn't contradictory, then we wouldn't have to get rid of it, and we wouldn't have imperialism. But both of these things are true. The next point then is that we understand that capitalism is contradictory and crisis prone. Michael,
Well,
please go ahead.
yeah, the crisis of today's finance capitalism is not one of domestic overproduction within the production and consumption, the real economy. It's turned out to be debt deflation. And internationally, the foreign dollar debt burden has become a kind of neo-colonial leverage to impose austerity, as we've said,
so
and other
pause it
anti-labor.
really quick. So this is just kind of, I think Ghost Star was pushing back on this a little bit. So this is kind of what I wanted to they talked a little bit more about this, where the U.S. dollar is over leveraged in finance capital and by issuing debt to other countries. And what's particularly alarming to me, not in terms that I think it's necessarily a bad thing, just in terms of the U.S. dollar, is that you have a country like Argentina, where if they actually do become a member of BRICS, they've already defaulted on IMF, I think 2 or 3 times. So it represents really quite a significant shock in how the U.S. is able to maintain the value of the dollar.
It's a big fuck you.
It's a huge fuck you to the IMF.
Big fuck you.
So
clear
it's very, 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 very important that so much of colonialism comes from the ability to issue debt, and that not being able to issue debt is going to lead the U.S. to fucking war. It will lead us to fucking war. I think it will lead us to war.
On the non-U.S. U.S. economy. So the kind of crises and internal contradiction that the international economy is suffering now, as it's being polarized, is not basically what Marx talked about in Volume 1. Although if you read Volume 2 and 3, you can see his focus on finance. Certainly, I filled that out. So let's talk a bit about what this crisis is and the way it's taking form today. The United States government is the world's largest debtor. And it says, we're the unique nation. We're the only country that does not have to pay our foreign debt. And in fact, there's no way that the government foreign debt, which means the bank reserves of the whole rest of the world that are kept in dollars, none of this can be repaid. It's just they can trade it with each other, but they're never supposed to ask to be repaid. Only the U.S. private sector and the U.S. government can ask other countries to repay their debt. That is the internal contradiction that has driven the world economy apart and is splitting it and is forcing other countries to either face permanent sort of neo-feudal dependency on the United States, or to say, well, we get to develop too. It's not going to be just a monopoly of the European.
Do I need to repeat that? $30 trillion debt. You see why I'm always like, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. The whole world just agrees that the U.S. debt doesn't matter. And because we print our own currency, we pretend it doesn't matter, even though the Republicans, the Democrats use it as a fucking wedge issue, whether to freaking do austerity measures.
That was the entire Republican debate. It was the division.
Yeah, dude, it's fucking bullshit.
All Republicans care about is the fucking
complete.
That's all.
I'm so glad you're over electoralism, because this shit makes sense, right? You look at this and you're like he's saying is they have 30 trillion in debt. And then you think about it for a second. Yeah. If they made it up to 30 trillion, it really doesn't make sense that they're ever going to pay it back, does it? How do you even imagine 30 trillion? Do you remember being a kid when our debt was 1 trillion, 2 trillion? Maybe after 9/11, it was probably 4 trillion, 6 trillion, So seeing 30 trillion and then hearing Michael Hudson being yeah, we're the whole world agrees that's never going to be paid back. It's kind of oh yeah, duh. Who actually thinks that a country can afford to pay $30 trillion? Who actually
we're living through a real world situation where you kind of have, you're dealing with a daycare full of kids, and you're dealing with the one intolerant, really bad, throwing constant tantrums. The one that was clearly
all right, so let's get to 54. Let's get to the 5438 then, because I think I think you're kind of right, but at the same time, it's also like this is just what they do. This is just what they do.
Well, I mean, but so like, I mean, how else are you going to tame a crying baby that's throwing tantrums? You're going to have
and that's why I think war is inevitable. That's why I think war is inevitable.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, let's
say, first of all, that any given crisis is never any one thing. It's, of course, there is a financial crisis today, but today's crisis is composed today's crisis is composed of a financial crisis, but there is also an underlying productive crisis, a crisis of low investment, low growth, low profits, etc. Furthermore, there is a crisis of not sufficiently expanding demand, which has been with us for a long time. So, one of the ways I've tried to deal with this is that, Marx, and I've actually, in my latest book, I have the most developed form of that table. I've actually created a table, because in capitalism, there are at least two forms of crisis. One is vertical, that is, it has to do with the exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class, and the other is horizontal. It has to do with the various ways in which various capitalists relate to one another, namely via competition. So both the mechanisms of competition and exploitation.
Just really quick,
that's a good because you see that a lot with like even in our politics, when you live in a two-party system,
people pretend that
work together. They do work at the end of the day. It is vertical, but they're operating in factions, sort of like the mafia, in very similar ways actually, where they're operating. They're serving the same master, but they're fighting each other, and you see this a lot. And I was actually like talking to John about this with the Tupac situation with the Crips and the Bloods. You kind of like it's
right.
We sort of like it's easier to let people let them fight amongst each other than and be controlling both sides than it is to. The capitalists always pick both sides. They always pick both sides.
Well, so it's like the capitalist always has two priorities. Okay, how to keep cheap labor, right? Because that's where all their surplus value comes from. That's where all their profit comes from. Okay, and that's what the vertical crisis is, right? Essentially class warfare all the time, right? Trying to keep prices low, trying to keep us working as much as possible, trying to deprive us of any autonomy. That's like their primary goal. However, within that, they might not agree with every other freaking oligarch on the planet, right? And that's like the horizontal crisis, where it's like maybe that guy also has a monopoly in his own country and he's trying to open up shop in my country. That's a horizontal crisis, right?
I guess you see that with like Saudi Arabia and stuff like. Okay.
That's kind of so Saudi Arabia is actually a good example because they just had the new golf association, right?
And some shit in
so there's PGA and what Live Golf, right? Those two corporations, and Saudi Arabia was bidding a bunch of American golfers like hundreds of millions of dollars to go play for Live Golf, and so that was a horizontal crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, yes, like you said earlier, vertical crises always exist because they're always trying to freaking take advantage of us. They're always trying to exploit us. But it's important to keep in mind, like you were saying, that they always try and make it about like, oh, it's just the cronies, or it's just these one particular rich people that are the problem. It's just these guys. And it's like, well, no, there's all these guys that exist that all do the same thing. You just don't like these guys. So there's different factions, but that's kind of like the important thing here. Let's see. We've talked about that one.
The last many decades, layer upon layer of financial crises.
Okay.
Well, you can see the crisis in the United States. Why cannot there be investment in the United States? The largest companies, the Standard & Poor 500, have spent.
Why can't we have nice things?
92% of their profits, of their net income, on stock buybacks and on paying out as dividends. Only 8% is to invest. They can't find anything to invest in. Apple has said, we cannot find a single penny to invest new, so we're paying more money in stock buybacks and dividends than we're actually investing. We're asset stripping. And finance capitalism is primarily extractive. it has loaded the economy down with debt so much by debt-financed housing, by making its labor have to earn a high enough wage to pay its housing debt, its education debt, its
Important
automobile
kind of
debt, its
side
credit
note
card
that he
debt.
doesn't really go into here is that this is why we have 2% inflation every year, but it's actually closer to 4%, is because we issue more debt than we have cash.
And we're gonna have to keep on doing this every.
Have to keep doing
How
it.
do you know how many we're gonna go through so many different bank crises.
I had stuff to talk about the housing crisis tonight, guys. You guys aren't ready.
No, but we're gonna have to keep financing these capitalists by printing the money and funding them
So-
every single. That's essentially what we're doing. We're
So
just
this is the first year. This is the first year where our just to service the national debt, okay, is almost the same amount as the defense budget. In like July, it was like 600 billion just to service the debt. That means of all the debt, the national debt in the country, that 30 trillion just for us to fucking not default on our debt. The US American taxpayer has to fucking just make that money disappear. Almost $1 trillion just disappears every year into freaking capitalist hands just because we're servicing a debt. Now, can you imagine what would happen if we just nationalized the banks and we didn't have to service debt anymore? Like, where's that $600 billion going? Where's that $1 trillion bill going, to service a debt? It's just going into somebody's hands. Somebody's going into somebody's pocket. Fucking bullshit.
they're gonna need it. They're gonna need it in the next couple of years. Let's run it to 102.
Okay. That's probably good. Yeah.
Imperialism essentially is declining the way I look at it because, think about it this way. The high point of imperialism, since which point it has been declining gradually, too slowly for me, but nevertheless declining, is 1914. 1914 was the high point of imperialism. In the previous decades, not only had Britain acquired its big empire, but a number of other countries appeared that they'd also tried to acquire empires. And so the world was essentially divided up into these big empires. So that was the high point of imperialism, but it was also the moment at which the big crisis of the imperialist world order broke. The wars between the imperial powers substantially weakened them, and then that combined with the rise of communism and the struggles for decolonization in third world countries essentially put the world onto the long and slow road of the decline of imperialism and so on. But that moment also coincided with, I would say, the peak of capitalism, according to Marx anyway, because really, by this point in time, capitalism in its homelands had already entered the monopoly phase. At that point, capitalism really didn't have that much more to give to the rest of the world, to the world in general. That is to say, it had done what it could in terms of developing the forces of production, and now the point was that they would be better developed if we had other forms of production, socialist, whatever, some or the other version of socialism. So, and this was, by the way, witnessed when you saw.
Important point right here to drive home, because a lot of people think that socialism is just when you get stuff, and that's not what socialism is, and that's not what she's describing here. Okay, when I said earlier, all socialism is or nationalism is really like owning the resources instead of like private capital owning the resources. The state owns resources, like whether it's the bank, whether it's the trains, whether it's Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. It's the state that owns it, so they can reinvest in stuff like trains. And she's saying, what is to be gained by a country that is run by a bunch of monopolies, like private monopolies? What is to be gained by that? What can we possibly, as proles, as workers, or as a government, as a state, like how do we grow from having just private monopolies? We don't. It stagnates. When there's a monopoly, they have an incentive to just jack the prices up, or if there's a couple other monopolies, they got a cartel going, they do price fixing, they know how to deflate wages. There's a lot of things that monopolies can do to start controlling a company, and that's kind of where we're at now. And Marx's argument was like, again, great opportunity for us to say, hey, thanks for doing all the great work and monopolizing for us. It's time that those resources are now invested in the people. You laid out great groundwork to get things going for us. It's now time for the state to do some central planning and point this country in the right direction because we have a robust industrialized system.
It's been a slow decline ever since then.
Absolutely.
They're just like
they're just like trying to figure out how to fucking keep it going. You could probably actually just go to.
It's more like a controlled demo.
Are you at 107? Yeah, you could probably just go to 107.
That's Bidenomics. That seems to be what's happening in the U.S. economy now. The wealthiest 1 to 10% are making so much money that it exceeds the deprivation and the indebtedness and the reduction and shrinkage of the 99% economy. And so probably, the only hope that the United States has
I wonder. Let me finish this sentence.
of maintaining this kind of prosperity for the wealthiest financial class is to freeze the status quo, to block any kind of active government policies to promote labor and industry at home or abroad.
Yeah,
and the industrial capitalism.
Great point. So, as he mentioned earlier, okay, so when you go and turn on freaking CNN or MSNBC and they're like, the economy is booming. Okay, this is fucking crazy. It's fucking crazy. Okay, our economy is so over financialized that the
People
top
don't understand. Like, we live in a silent depression. I don't know if people are aware that we're talking about.
People are so out of touch.
Like, no, if you do not you have to show your parents an inflation calculator. They won't get it. They simply just won't.
I showed a friend. I talked a friend out of getting a house the other day because I showed her a mortgage calculator. She's like, absolutely not.
Yeah. Crazy. What we're living on today is like basically like 15K of like what? And we're living like what 30% of like what the Great Depression was. Like we're not.
Yeah.
We're
past where the French Revolution was.
We're in a worse spot, like way worse spot now than the Great Depression.
Great Depression, French Revolution, like Roman Empire.
And people just don't get it. They just don't
what's
get
funny,
it.
I want to finish this point really quick. So, listen, this is people. So the FIRE sector, finance and real estate. Okay, this isn't people working at like a Starbucks and getting a paycheck and then cashing that paycheck at the bank. This is people who trade stocks. This is people who operate on hedge funds. This is people who mess around with different securities, right? They turn, I'm not trying to get down, but they turn money into more money, right? That's what a capitalist does. And what he's saying is the top 10%, okay, top 10% of all Americans are responsible for the economy growing. So bottom 90% could be doing dog shit. We're doing terribly. And the economy is doing great because we're so over financialized and there's so many people trading around fake pieces of paper that the economy can look fine on paper. Okay. So next time you hear somebody saying the economy is doing great, just know that it's because 10% of Americans all got together and traded a bunch of pieces of paper.
But it's all fake. The economy is all fake.
I mean, freaking Marx talks about fictitious capital, and there's a whole thing to be said about NFTs, but that's a whole nother day.
Oh my God.